We were brought up together. There was not quite a year difference in our ages. I need not say that we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Harmony was the soul of our companionship, and the diversity and contrast that subsisted in our characters drew us nearer together. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, but with all my ardor I was capable of a more intense application and was more deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge. She busied herself with following the aerial creations of the poets, and in the majestic and wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss home. The sublime shapes of the mountains, the changes of the seasons, tempest and calm, the silence of winter, and the life and turbulence of our alpine summers. She found ample scope for admiration and delight, while my companion contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things. I delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness akin to rapture, as they were unfolded to me, are among the earliest sensations I can remember. The rise of a young mad scientist. That's one thing that happens in this chapter, but there is also something possibly infinitely more compelling, if you ask me. This chapter contains one of the most brilliant, stunningly brilliant subversions of the writer-reader relationship that I have come across in quite some time, and we will get into that in the Writer's Corner portion of this video. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for Chapter 2 of a chapter-by-chapter read-along of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This video will contain 3 separate sections, a So What Happened recap of the chapter that we just read, Chapter 2 of Frankenstein, a literary criticism section for this chapter, which is really going to be just a discussion mainly of some different scientists that popped up in this chapter, and finally a Writer's Corner portion of the video where we talk about some of the writerly things that we can take from this chapter of the novel. So, what happened? Victor tells us how he grew close with Elizabeth, and while she was occupied with arts and aesthetics, Victor was more concerned with the way things worked. When Victor is 7, his parents have a second son. This forces them to settle down in Geneva. While in school, Victor makes friends with a boy named Henry, son of a merchant, and he was a boy who was daring and outgoing, sort of the opposite of Victor. Victor then ventures to explain his preoccupation with science. Seems a bit defensive, but whatever. When he was 13, he went on vacation where he finds the works of Cornelius Agrippa. He is enthralled. But when he shares his interest with his father calls it trash. That science is now all about chemicals. Victor is not perturbed and goes on to get all of Agrippa's works, as well as Paracelsus and Albert Magnus, and he becomes fixated on the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life, before settling on the Elixir of Life as his own life's work. The next wonder to catch our narrator's fancy happens in the midst of a massive storm. The young mad scientist-to-be witnesses the power of lightning as a lightning strike completely destroys a massive oak tree. After a family friend explains electricity to Victor, he decides that maybe his father was right and he disavows his former studies, instantly growing a hot-blooded hatred for would-be sciences. as far as the actual literary criticisms are concerned for this chapter, it was a very short chapter. Again, these seem to be very well parsed sections of writing, so there's not a whole lot of real deep literary criticism in this one chapter, but I thought we could go over some of the science stuff and philosophy stuff that was mentioned. And so I went through just cursory through the Wikipedia pages on the three big thinkers that are mentioned mostly in this chapter, and I kind of tried to parse out the items which were maybe relevant enough to talk about. So obviously Cornelius Agrippa was mentioned, so I've got his works here and the explanation of them from Wikipedia. Again, I'm not an expert on any of this, but I thought that it would be a decent enough place to start. The first work mentioned by Wikipedia, Declamation Attacking the Uncertainty and Vanity of the Sciences and Arts, 1526, printed in Cologne in 1527, a skeptical satire of the sad state of science. This book, a significant production of the revival of Pyrrhonic skepticism in its fittest mode, I'm not familiar with that word, was to have a significant influence on such thinkers as Montaigne, Descartes, and Goethe, not to mention Victor Frankenstein. Declamation of Nobility and Preeminence of the Female Sex, 1529, a book pronouncing the theological and moral superiority of women. Maybe, appears in Mary Shelley. That could have something to do with it. Then we have 3 books concerning occult philosophy. This is really where I think the adoption and then dropping of Agrippa comes from. Book 1, printed in Paris in 1531, books 2 and 3 in Cologne in 1533. So you're seeing all of these books sort of a couple 300 years before where we're looking at with Victor Frankenstein here. This summa of occult and magical thought, Agrippa's most important work in a number of respects, sought a solution to the skepticism proposed in De Vinitate. In short, Agrippa argued for a synthetic vision of magic whereby the natural world combined with the celestial and divine through, Neoplatonic participation, such that ordinary licit natural magic was in fact validated by a kind of demonic magic. I don't think that it is any coincidence that we are getting the demonic mentioned here, at least as far as why this may have been picked by Mary Shelley. Sourced ultimately from God. By this means, Agrippa proposed that magic that could resolve all epistemological problems raised by skepticism in a total validation of Christian faith. If I had to guess, the very text being mentioned here that was found by Victor, it would be one of the 3 books concerning occult philosophy, and then he would have gone backwards in this list, just sort of discussing those things, finding those texts, and traveling through those ideas. Again, this is a type of philosophy science, a backing into the observations that you can make. This is starting maybe with the observation, but getting back to the things that you can measure by picking your answer first and kind of reasoning back into them. Then we have Paracelsus. Paracelsus's approach to science was heavily influenced by his religious beliefs. So here's an interesting thing with this. The heavy emphasis on religion here. There are many notable people through history who start very young, believing that they have some divinity in them, believing that they have something which is on the level of saintly or on the level of a Christ-like figure. Nietzsche thought this when he was young. Einstein thought this when he was young. So to see ideas like this, to see Victor gravitating towards ideas like this, is not all that strange if you're looking at things from a sort of psychological perspective. He believed that science and religion were inseparable, and scientific discoveries were direct messages from God. Thus, he believed it was mankind's divine duty to uncover and understand all of his message. Paracelsus had also believed that the virtues that made up natural objects are not natural but supernatural and existed in God before the creation of the universe. Because of this, when the earth and the heavens eventually dissipate, the virtues of all objects will continue to exist and simply return to God. His philosophy about the true nature of the virtues is reminiscent of Aristotle's idea of the natural place of elements. To Paracelsus, the purpose of science is not only to learn more about the world around us, but also to search for divine signs and potentially understand the nature of God. If a person who doesn't believe in God became a physician, he would not have standing in God's eyes and would not succeed in their work because he did not practice in his name. Becoming an effective physician requires faith in God. Paracelsus saw medicine as more than a perfunctory practice. To him, medicine was a divine mission, and good character combined with devotion to God was more important than personal skill. He encouraged physicians to practice self-improvement and humility along with studying philosophy to gain new experiences. Again, just a very strong emphasis on the religion part of science. If there is not a divide between the two, and Paracelsus here is insisting, in fact, that there is not. But Frankenstein goes on to disavow that belief. Right? He goes on to drop these different philosophers once electricity is explained to him. Albert Magnus. In the centuries since his death, many stories arose about Albert as an alchemist and magician. This, I think, is the important part with Albert Magnus. Much of the modern confusion results from the fact that later works, particularly the alchemical work known as the Secreta Alberti or the Experimenta Alberti, were falsely attributed to Albertus by their authors to increase the prestige of the text through association. On the subject of alchemy and chemistry, many treatises relating to alchemy have been attributed to him, though in his authentic writings he had little to say on the subject, and then mostly through commentary on Aristotle. For example, in his commentary De Mineralibus, he refers to the power of stones, but does not elaborate on what these powers might be. A wide range of pseudo-Albertine works dealing with alchemy exist, though, showing the belief developed in the generations following Albert's death that he had mastered alchemy, one of the fundamental sciences of the Middle Ages. These include metals and materials, the secrets of chemistry, the origin of metals, the origin of compounds, and a concordance, which is a collection of observations on the philosopher's stone and other alchemy chemistry topics collected under the name Theatrum Chemicum. He is credited with the discovery of the element arsenic and experimented with photosensitive chemicals, including silver nitrate. He did believe that stones had occult properties, as he related in his work De Minerabilis. However, there is scant evidence that he personally performed alchemical experiments. According to legend, Albert is said to have discovered the Philosopher's Stone and passed it on to his pupil, Thomas Aquinas, shortly before his death. Albert does not confirm he discovered the stone in his writings, but he did record that he witnessed the creation of gold by transmutation. Given that Thomas Aquinas died 6 years before Albert's death, the legend, as stated, is unlikely. So those are the big ideas with the original set of scientists / philosophers with which Victor had fallen in love in the beginning of this chapter. But there's one other scientist, still acclaimed, that is mentioned, and there's a couple things that are interesting with that mention. The scientist, of course, briefly mentioned in this chapter is Isaac Newton. Here's something that's just fun to play with. Isaac Newton died in 1727. Frankenstein is published in 1818. Basically, the timeline there is that this is like today someone writing a book with a mention of Albert Einstein. It is just interesting to think. So today we think of Isaac Newton kind of almost on the verge of ancient. But during the time where Einstein was written, Isaac Newton was basically still the cutting edge of science. And part of the reason for that is one of my favorite ideas that has to do a lot with science, but sometimes with literature too. The idea of the annus mirabilis, the idea of the miracle year. Both Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein I've talked about in this video, so I would like to talk a little bit about the idea of their miracle years. Again, just bringing in some outside text stuff because we have a lot of videos to make on this book, and these things are fun for me. So Isaac Newton had Isaac Newton had an annus mirabilis, a miracle year, in 1666. Semi-ironic for how devout a Christian he was. But of his miracle year, Wikipedia, again, says this: the year of wonders. In 1666, Isaac Newton, aged 23, made revolutionary inventions and discoveries in calculus, motion, optics, and gravitation. It was in this year that Newton was alleged to have observed an apple falling from a tree, and in which, in any case, hit upon the laws of natural gravitation. He was afforded that time to work on his theories due to the closure of Cambridge University by an outbreak of the plague. He stated and proved the binomial theorem, invented calculus. I believe it's differentiated or differential calculus, not just calculus, but I'm not an expert on that either, but a form of calculus. Formulated the universal law of gravitation and developed the theory of color. Now, the idea of the miracle year, basically, this is such an inspiring idea, but basically what it says is someone had a year where they kind of recessed, they kind of disappeared, and when they came out of that year, they had so much work that they changed the world in their field in 1 year. So the claim here is that in a single year that was marred by the plague. Now, what did you do in 2020? I didn't discover calculus. I didn't write the theory of color. Newton did. Newton took that 1 year to come up with the binomial theorem, invented calculus, formulated the universal law of gravitation, and developed a theory of color. So much work, so transformative, that you call that a miracle year. It is a miracle that someone could do that in a single year. Now, Einstein, in 1905, had his very own miracle year. It was in this year that Albert Einstein, aged 26, published the important discoveries concerning the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, the special theory of relativity, and the famous E equals mc squared equation. His 4 articles, collectively known as his Annus Mirabilis papers, were published in Annalen der Physik in 1905. These 2 years, 1666 and 1905, if you just take those 2 people out of those 2 years, in all of history, the world is completely different. Eventually, probably, people would have gotten to those ideas. But it would have taken a lot longer. There are, for example, with Einstein, there are theories that there were a couple people that were close to I can't remember if it was relativity or the E equals mc squared equation, that there were a couple people that were close to that, picking around the edges of it. They just didn't get there before Einstein. But guys, part of the reason that Einstein blew up in the way he did is because no one believed his ideas until one person did and published them. And then everybody said, okay, well, we've got to give it the time of day. Let's look at it. And when they did, they realized, oh, the way we thought about everything is completely wrong. So that is an interesting thing, and I'm sure the same is there with Isaac Newton. I'm just not as close to the Isaac Newton papers as I am to Einstein's because I've read a couple of biographies on Einstein. Now, the last talking point here is we get Victor's life philosophy in this chapter. It is page 37 in my text. Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death? Here we have Victor saying, look, if I can make this discovery, the elixir of life, if I can make this discovery, no one will die except through violence. I will remove all natural occurrences of death. You will not age out. You will not die of a heart attack. You will not die because your organs fail. None of those things will happen. The only way that you could die is through violence. 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 What an interesting set of thoughts. You know, Marilyn Monroe said that if you can make a girl laugh, you can make her do anything. I have always said that if you can make a reader feel something, you can make them go along with anything. But there may be an even deeper truth to the writer-reader relationship than that, which is simply this. If you can make a reader forget, you can make them do anything. You can make them feel anything. You can make them love anyone. There is one of the most beautiful subversions of the writer-reader relationship in this chapter of Frankenstein that I have seen in quite some time. And here's where it is. During the time that Frankenstein was written, there was only a certain type of person who was a reader. And today, there's probably mainly only a certain type of person who reads a book like Frankenstein. These are going to be people who are probably curious. These are going to be people who are probably fairly intelligent to have an interest in a classic book like Frankenstein. These are going to be people who are probably somewhat scientifically minded. These are people who are probably with an early life bent toward a certain subject matter. If you think back to your early childhood, probably there was an interest in some type of subject. And you will think that that is universal because it was your entire experience. For me, it was a lot of things. It was reading. I had an interest in science. I had an interest in the paranormal, but I pursued these things all my livelong hours. There is probably, if you're here watching this video, something in your childhood very much like that. Probably, if you were here, it is literature or it is science/science fiction, sort of the hybrid of the two. Now, the beautiful part of that in this novel is simply this. Presenting a reader with a character like themselves, the reader has no choice but to sympathize with that character, has no choice really but to like that character, has no choice really but to extend to that character at least a modicum of like. You like that character with whom you identify. Victor, here, who's going to do some questionable things in this novel, has an early childhood obsession, like you did, has an early childhood curiosity, like you did, has an early life scientifically minded bent, probably like you did, is intelligent, probably like you would assume that you were, right? I don't think that you would probably describe yourself as being an intelligent child. That would seem to be a breach of taste. But I think that if you were to think back, probably if you were here on video 2 of a read-along series for Frankenstein, you were a bit of a loner as a kid. Probably that was because you were different than other kids. Now, you're going to be sympathetic in this novel to Victor. So you are going to find yourself using reason to defend Victor. You're going to find yourself being emotionally torn by the circumstance in which Victor finds himself. That does not have to be the case for a protagonist. That does not have to be the case for a main character. Probably part of the reason that this novel has lived on so long is not just the science fiction bent of the work. Probably part of the reason this novel has lived so long is that when people read it, they find themselves liking Victor, at least on some level. Now, I have to express when it was that I caught on to this. Victor was absolutely enraptured by a thunderstorm. You like thunderstorms, don't you? This is an ultimate subversion of the writer-reader relationship. You are going to like Victor, and in many respects, you're not even going to understand why. It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction.